Captain Varian's boots echoed on the stone floor of the grand hall, the rhythmic sound a sharp contrast to the murmurs of hushed voices surrounding him. His arrival had been expected, but the welcome was as cold as the stone walls themselves. He had seen this kind of tension before, the kind that hung in the air like a storm waiting to break. His eyes scanned the room, noting the mix of pride and suspicion in the eyes of the beast-folk delegates. The half-beast woman sitting at the head of the table was the one he had come for. Lyra, a diplomat of her faction, but more than that, a towering figure who wielded power in ways that were not immediately obvious. She was tall, nearly 7 feet, with feline-like features. Her fur, a mixture of silvery gray and white, glinted in the low light of the chamber. Her eyes, the color of amber, studied him carefully as he approached. Varian was no stranger to high-stakes negotiations. He had been in countless situations where tempers flared, where alliances teetered on the edge of collapse. But this was different. Lyra was different. Her presence, the strength she exuded, made even the seasoned general uneasy. Her posture was rigid, like a lioness waiting for the first sign of weakness. And yet, when she met his gaze, there was something deeper beneath the surface, something he couldn't quite place. He took his seat at the table, keeping his back straight, his hands clasped in front of him. The air between them was thick with the unspoken. The room fell silent as both sides prepared for the meeting to begin, but no one dared speak yet, the tension unbearable. "You're late," Lyra finally spoke, her voice a low, melodic purr that seemed to vibrate in the back of his skull. "I'm here now," Varian replied, his tone measured, not giving an inch. Lyra's eyes narrowed slightly, though the motion was so subtle, it could have been missed by anyone less perceptive. "I hope the delay wasn't a tactic. We don't have time for games, human." Varian felt his pulse quicken, but he remained composed. "I assure you it wasn't. I've come for peace, just as we agreed." Her eyes flickered over him, assessing him with the quiet precision of a predator. "Peace? How quaint. I doubt your kingdom is truly interested in peace, General. Peace doesn't bring power or wealth." Varian clenched his jaw. The words hit too close to home. His kingdom was indeed teetering on the brink of collapse, and yet he believed in peace. He believed there was a way to end the fighting. He had to, for everyone's sake. "You're wrong," he said, keeping his voice steady. "We're here to end the bloodshed, to save what remains." Lyra tilted her head, studying him, her amber eyes never leaving his. "Perhaps, but you'll find that the beast folk are not so easily swayed by words." Varian didn't flinch, though her words stung. He had no idea what kind of power she truly held, but he could sense it in the air, the way the others in the room looked to her, the subtle way her presence made the entire room tense, as though they were all aware of something unsaid. She stood abruptly, her long limbs unfolding with graceful power, and Varian couldn't help but watch her, captivated by the way she moved. Her fur shimmered in the dim light, and her tail flicked restlessly behind her, as though it too was an extension of her sharp mind. She was danger wrapped in elegance, and the air seemed to grow thicker when she moved. "If peace is truly what you want," she said, "prove it. Your kingdom has one chance to offer us something worth our time. Otherwise, this meeting is over." Varian held his ground, his eyes locking onto hers, a silent challenge passing between them. He had seen this before, a dangerous game of power, a battle of wills, but he had never encountered an opponent like this. He leaned forward, his voice low and steady. "I'm not here to play games, Lyra. My kingdom will give you whatever you need to secure peace. But I need to know we can trust each other. And that starts now." She paused for a moment, her eyes flicking to the others in the room before she turned back to him. "Trust." She seemed almost amused, but there was a flicker of something darker in her gaze. "You humans are quick to demand trust. You're lucky that I am willing to even entertain this conversation." Varian's chest tightened. He didn't flinch. "Then let's start with something simple. What do you want?" Lyra stepped closer, her movements fluid, and Varian's breath caught in his throat. There was something magnetic about her, something primal that made his pulse quicken despite himself. She didn't stop until she was nearly in front of him, their faces only a few inches apart. Her eyes searched his for a moment before she spoke, her voice a mere whisper. I want assurance. Assurance that your people will stop hunting my kin, that they will stop hunting me. Varian's heart beat a little faster at her proximity, at the raw honesty in her voice. The words cut deeper than he had anticipated. He had heard rumors of humans hunting beast folk, but hearing it directly from Lyra made it feel real, the weight of it settling in his chest. I can't speak for every human, Varian said, his voice barely above a whisper. But I can promise that I will do everything in my power to stop it, to protect you. The words slipped from his mouth before he could stop them, and he immediately regretted them, though not for the reasons he might have thought. The moment they hung in the air between them, he realized how deeply he had meant them. Lyra's eyes softened for a brief moment, and in that instant, he felt a shiver run through him, though he wasn't sure why. Then, as quickly as it had come, the softness disappeared, replaced once again by the cool, calculating diplomat he had first encountered. You will have your chance to prove it, General, she said, stepping back, her gaze still sharp. But we are not so easily convinced. Varian nodded, though his mind was still reeling. The attraction he felt toward Lyra was undeniable, but there was also a sense of danger, a deep, unspoken threat that hummed in the air whenever they were near each other. He had to remind himself of his duty. This was a negotiation, not a seduction. But as he watched her move back to her seat, his thoughts were interrupted by the distant sound of approaching footsteps. Something had changed. A new, unseen threat was looming. Varian could feel it. Lyra's eyes snapped to the door, and in that instant Varian knew that their meeting was no longer just about politics. The stakes had risen, and they had only just begun. The door to the grand hall creaked open, breaking the tense silence that had settled between Varian and Lyra. Both their heads snapped toward the sound, their bodies instinctively alert. The air seemed to grow heavier, the oppressive weight of the moment becoming almost unbearable. A figure entered, cloaked in shadow, followed by two of Lyra's trusted warriors. The newcomer's identity was masked, but there was an unmistakable aura of authority. Varian's hand instinctively went to the hilt of his sword, though he didn't draw it. The moment had changed. There was no longer a question of political posturing. Something deeper was at play. Lyra's expression shifted, no longer the cool diplomat, but something more dangerous. She rose from her chair with a fluid, predatory grace, her eyes narrowing as she studied the figure before them. What is this? She demanded, her voice sharp, though it carried an undercurrent of caution. The masked figure didn't respond immediately. Instead, they walked toward the center of the room with deliberate, measured steps. Varian's gaze flicked to the guards behind him. They were tense, but they didn't move to challenge the newcomer. It was clear that this person was no ordinary threat. Lyra's eyes darted between the figure and Varian, a flicker of uncertainty passing over her face before she regained her composure. We were negotiating, she said, her voice colder now, more guarded. Who are you to interrupt? The figure stopped just a few feet from her, and for a moment, there was only silence. Then the voice came, a voice that was familiar to Varian, though altered, distorted somehow. I am here because peace is no longer an option. Varian's heart skipped a beat. He knew that voice. It was a voice he had heard only in whispers, a voice that belonged to one of his own, the enemy within. His mind raced, the implications of the words hanging heavy in the air. A traitor, a betrayer planted among his ranks. The sabotage he had sensed earlier now made a terrible, terrifying sense. Lyra's eyes locked onto Varian's, an unspoken understanding passing between them. The truth was out. There were those in both their factions who did not want peace. And it seemed that the disruption was only just beginning. Why are you here? Lyra asked, her voice now low, as though she were speaking to a cornered animal. What do you want? The figure's laughter, harsh and mocking, cut through the tension in the room. I came to ensure that there would be no peace. I came to ensure that both your people would burn. Varian felt a chill crawl down his spine. The realization hit him like a thunderclap. The sabotage had been deliberate. There were factions within both the human and beastfolk alliances working together to push the war forward. But the question remained, who was the true mastermind? Before he could process further, the figure stepped forward and removed the hood, revealing a face that Varian knew all too well. His jaw tightened as he recognized the traitor. Seraphim one of his most trusted officers. A man who had disappeared months ago under suspicious circumstances. Now he stood before them, his eyes cold and devoid of remorse. You, Varian hissed, his hand tightening around the hilt of his sword. What are you doing here? Seraphim smiled, but it was a cruel, twisted smile. I'm here because you're weak, both of you. Peace is a lie. It will never work. Not with people like you in charge. Lyra took a step forward, her posture predatory, her tail flicking behind her in agitation. You think we are weak? She asked, her voice soft but laced with venom. You think you can destroy what we've built so easily? Seraphim's eyes gleamed with an unsettling confidence. I think you've underestimated the forces at play, both human and beast alike. We have our own plans, ones that will ensure this war burns hotter than either of you can imagine. The room was thick with tension now, a palpable pressure that seemed to weigh on Varian's chest. His instincts screamed at him to act, but he knew better than to rush in recklessly. Lyra was already calculating her next move, her amber eyes flicking between Seraphim and the warriors stationed around the room. Varian's gaze never left Seraphim, even as he spoke to Lyra. We need to contain this before it spirals. If we allow him to escape, I won't let him. Lyra interrupted, her voice low and dangerous. She was already moving, her lithe frame almost a blur as she closed the distance between herself and Seraphim. The traitor barely had time to react before she was upon him, her strong hands gripping his shoulders and pushing him back. You've underestimated me, she said softly, her voice dark and predatory. If you think you can break this alliance so easily, you're wrong. Seraphim sneered, his expression twisting into something almost maniacal. You don't understand the forces you're dealing with. They're already in motion. You can't stop it. No one can. The words hung in the air like a curse. Varian's grip tightened on his sword, but he knew that violence wouldn't solve this. Not yet. They needed answers. They needed to understand who else was involved, and more importantly, why. Tell us who's behind this, Varian demanded, stepping forward. Who else is working with you? Seraphim remained silent for a long moment, as though weighing the consequences of speaking. Finally, he spoke, his voice dripping with disdain. You'll find out soon enough. There's no escaping it now. Before either Varian or Lyra could act, Seraphim pulled a small device from his belt and threw it to the ground with a harsh, mechanical click. The room was instantly filled with a deafening noise. Screeching alarms, the sound of metal grinding against metal, a countdown echoing from every corner. Lyra recoiled, her ears flattening against her head, but she remained composed, her instincts telling her that they had little time left. Varian's heart raced. The traitor had activated something. A trap, a bomb, something worse. No! Varian shouted, drawing his sword and moving toward Seraphim. But the traitor had already begun to slip into the shadows, disappearing into the darkened corridors beyond. Lyra's voice cut through the chaos, sharp and commanding. We have no time to chase him now. We need to deal with the threat, now. Varian nodded, his mind already calculating their next move. They would have to stop whatever Seraphim had set in motion, but more than that, they would have to work together now more than ever. The tension between them was undeniable, but in that moment, it was clear. They both had a common enemy. They turned, moving swiftly toward the source of the chaos, the uncertainty of what lay ahead pulling them forward. As they left the hall behind, the growing sense of urgency between them was palpable, an unspoken understanding that the stakes had just been raised higher than either of them could have anticipated. The echoing sound of boots pounding on the cold stone floor filled the air as Varian and Lyra sprinted down the narrow corridors of the fortress. The alarm was still blaring, its shrill wail reverberating through the halls, but they didn't stop. Each step was calculated, each movement swift, their destination clear. The control room where whatever Seraphim had activated was being managed. The tension between them was thick, a silent current that neither of them addressed directly. Lyra's pace was effortless, her long strides far outpacing his, but she didn't leave him behind. Her fur shimmered faintly under the dim lighting, her tail swishing behind her with a near-animal grace, while her expression remained cool and focused. Varian's breath was labored, but his mind raced, his military training kicking in, calculating their next steps, analyzing their situation. What exactly did he trigger? Varian asked, his voice barely above a breath as he caught up to her. Lyra's eyes flickered toward him, her amber gaze sharp. I don't know yet, but Seraphim wouldn't act without a purpose. He's dangerous, but not reckless. Whatever it is, it's already in motion. Varian nodded grimly. He'd seen men like Seraphim before. Men who worked in the shadows, manipulating events to their advantage. But this felt different. The sheer force of what Seraphim had done hinted at a level of planning, a level of threat that reached far beyond the individual. They reached a door at the end of a hallway, the metal frame adorned with intricate carvings, a stark contrast to the chaos that seemed to pulse in the air. Lyra's hand flew to the control panel beside the door, fingers dancing across the surface with practiced ease. Her claws clicked softly as they made contact with the interface, but there was no sign of hesitation in her movements. Her presence was magnetic, calm and confident even in the face of looming danger. Get ready, she said softly, her gaze flicking to Varian as the door began to open. The control room was a high-tech marvel, a stark contrast to the medieval architecture that surrounded the fortress. Screens flickered to life, displaying complex diagrams, maps, and data that Varian couldn't decipher. The tension in the room was palpable, a quiet hum of urgency as the countdown continued to tick down on one of the central monitors. Lyra stepped forward, her eyes narrowing as she scanned the room. She was quick, her movements swift and precise, as she connected to the central system. Varian watched her, feeling a momentary lapse in the urgency of the situation. There was something undeniably captivating about her. The way she moved, the way her strength seemed to radiate from her with every action. For a split second, their eyes met, and Varian felt a shift in the air, a subtle, unspoken connection. The tension between them was undeniable. It was more than just a need for alliance in the face of danger. There was a certain magnetism between them, an energy that neither could ignore, though neither spoke of it aloud. The heat that lingered in the space between them seemed to crackle, and Varian could feel his heartbeat quicken in response. But there was no time for distractions. Lyra's voice cut through his thoughts, bringing him back to the task at hand. We've got a problem. He activated the security locks across the facility. It's a trap, but I can bypass it. I need you to cover me. Varian nodded sharply, stepping forward as his eyes swept over the room, scanning for potential threats. He didn't need to be told twice. He was a soldier first, and his instincts screamed at him to stay alert. The urgency in Lyra's tone left no room for error. He positioned himself at the door, his sword drawn and ready. Every sense was heightened, every muscle tense as he listened for the sound of footsteps, any sign that they were not alone. It felt like waiting for a storm to hit, knowing that the calm before the chaos was always the most dangerous moment. I've got it, Lyra said after a moment, her voice steady as she began to type commands into the console. Her long fingers moved fluidly, and Varian could see the subtle tension in her shoulders as she worked. The stakes were rising. She was good, he had to give her that, but even she couldn't predict what Seraphim had set in motion. Suddenly, the lights in the room flickered, and a low hum filled the air. The screens that had been displaying seemingly benign data now shifted, the symbols morphing into a terrifying, real-time countdown. Lyra's eyes widened, and for the first time since their meeting, Varian saw a flicker of something approaching panic in her expression. 5 minutes, she said, her voice now tight with urgency. We need to move. Now. Varian didn't hesitate. He moved quickly to her side, keeping his body angled to shield her as best he could. The proximity to her sent a rush of heat through him. He could smell her scent, a blend of earth and something wild, something untamed. For a brief moment, he felt his resolve weaken, but he shook it off. This wasn't the time for distractions. The countdown was relentless. 3 minutes. 2. Each second felt like an eternity. I can't get the full deactivation, Lyra said, her brow furrowed in concentration. I can stop the explosion, but I'll need help. I need you to disable the power to the secondary systems. Varian nodded without question, already moving toward the far wall where the auxiliary control panel was located. His heart hammered in his chest, but he kept his mind focused on the task at hand. Lyra was depending on him. More than that, he realized he was depending on her. His hands moved over the panel with practiced precision, his fingers flying across the controls. The pressure was intense, but he had trained for moments like this, where every second mattered. Do it, Varian, Lyra urged, her voice breathless now. He could hear the strain in her voice, the weight of the situation pressing down on her too. He had no doubt she felt the same tension, the same urgency to finish this before everything was lost. He pressed the final sequence into the control panel, holding his breath as the hum of the room intensified. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, with a soft whir, the secondary systems powered down, and the countdown timer on the screens froze. Lyra exhaled, a sharp, relieved sound that echoed in the stillness of the room. Her amber eyes met his, filled with a mix of gratitude and something more, something deeper. She didn't speak, but her gaze lingered a moment longer than necessary, the unspoken connection between them undeniable. That was too close, she said, breaking the silence with a sharp exhale. Varian nodded, his chest still tight from the rush of adrenaline. We're not out of this yet. We need to find out who else is involved in this. Lyra straightened, her expression hardening once more. You're right. Seraphim might be the one who triggered this, but there's more going on here than we know. Varian's gaze shifted to the door, knowing that their troubles were far from over. The immediate danger had been dealt with, but the war, his war, was just beginning. And with Lyra by his side, the stakes had never been higher. The next move was theirs. But as they turned to face the corridor outside, a new sense of purpose ignited between them. They would find the traitors. Together. The control room was silent now, the countdown halted, and the humming machinery all but stilled. But the sense of impending danger hadn't disappeared. If anything, it had grown sharper, more focused. Varian stood at the door, his hand resting on the hilt of his sword, his eyes scanning the hallway outside. Lyra stood at his side, her posture tense, ears flicking as she listened for any signs of movement. It's not over, she murmured, her voice barely a whisper, but it cut through the air like a knife. Seraphim wouldn't risk everything on a single attack. There's something bigger behind all this. Varian nodded grimly. She was right. Everything about Seraphim's actions felt calculated, deliberate. If there was one thing the traitor was, it was patient. He had a plan, and that plan wasn't just about sabotage, it was about something far more dangerous. Varian's heart pounded in his chest, the realization settling like a stone in his stomach. Lyra turned to him, her amber eyes glowing faintly in the dim light. We need to find out who's backing him. There's a network here, and we can't afford to waste time hunting down shadows. We need information, and we need it fast. Varian could sense the urgency in her voice. For all her composure, the stakes had never been higher, and neither of them could afford to let their guard down. I'll go to the archives. There might be something there, something that could point us to the mastermind behind all of this. Lyra nodded, her expression hardening into something that bordered on resolve. I'll check the communications hub. We can trace his movements from there, maybe find his allies. If we're lucky, we'll intercept a message. Varian didn't hesitate. He turned and strode toward the exit, his boots echoing in the hallway. Lyra's footsteps followed close behind, her pace swift but measured. The tension between them remained, an unspoken awareness that neither of them acknowledged, but that neither could ignore. There was something raw about the way they moved together, something that spoke of a bond being formed in the heat of the moment. They didn't speak as they navigated the fortress's winding corridors. The place felt different now, like a living thing that had turned against them. The walls, once so familiar, now felt oppressive, as if they too were waiting for something to happen. Varian's thoughts raced. Seraphim had made his move, but what was his endgame? And more importantly, who else was involved? There had been whispers, rumors of factions within both the human and demi-human alliances, factions that weren't so interested in peace. Varian had always trusted his instincts, and right now, they were telling him that something far darker was at play. They reached the archive room, a large, imposing door guarded by two heavily armored soldiers. As they approached, Varian saw the soldiers exchange wary glances. It was clear that they had been told to be on high alert, but they didn't stop them. They couldn't afford to waste time on pleasantries. Varian pushed the door open with a forceful shove, and the soldiers stepped aside to allow them entry. Inside, the room was vast, lined with shelves full of ancient tomes, scrolls, and classified documents. It was the beating heart of their intelligence network, a place where secrets were stored and forgotten. Lyra lingered by the door for a moment, watching over him. Her eyes scanned the room, but she didn't move to touch anything. Instead, her gaze lingered on him, studying his every move. There was a quiet intensity in her gaze that made the air between them crackle, but Varian didn't acknowledge it. Not now. He moved toward the nearest shelf, scanning the spines of the books, searching for anything that might point to the traitors within their ranks. His fingers brushed against the leather-bound volumes, but they didn't yield anything useful. Frustration crept into his chest, but he pushed it aside. He couldn't afford to let his thoughts drift. "Varian," Lyra called softly, her voice cutting through the silence. "There's something strange about the latest intelligence reports. Come here." Varian turned and crossed the room to where she stood, her sharp eyes already scanning a set of documents on the nearby desk. The papers were arranged in neat piles, as if someone had carefully selected them for review. Lyra flipped through the first few pages, her expression darkening with every word she read. "This is recent," she said, her voice low, "but it doesn't make sense. These reports are heavily redacted, but there's a pattern. The same names keep appearing: high-ranking officers, military figures, both human and demi-human. They're all tied to Seraphim in some way." Varian's stomach tightened. He took a step forward and looked over her shoulder, his gaze scanning the reports. The names were familiar, but the connections were not. A network hidden beneath layers of bureaucracy and deceit. These were not just rogue individuals. They were part of a much larger scheme. Lyra flipped to the final page and handed it to him. There, scrawled in the margins, was a name that sent a shiver down Varian's spine. Tyrannes. The name of a powerful and influential figure in the human military, known for his extreme views on demi-human superiority. If he was involved in this, then everything Varian thought he knew was a lie. Lyra's eyes met his. Tyrannes is working with Seraphim. That's what this means. The alliance we've been fighting to maintain, it's a lie. They've been setting us up from the inside. Varian's jaw clenched, his fists tightening at his sides. The walls were closing in on him, the realization crashing down like a tidal wave. Tyrannes, the one man who had always preached about unity between their two factions. Now he was revealed to be the architect of the very destruction they had been trying to avoid. He didn't have time to process the weight of it. He had to act. "We need to stop him," Varian said, his voice low but filled with determination. "We need to find Tyrannes and put an end to this before it's too late." Lyra nodded, her expression fierce. "Agreed. We can't let this go any further. Tyrannes is dangerous, he has influence, and his supporters are everywhere. But we need to be careful. If we move too quickly, we might expose ourselves before we're ready." Varian's eyes flicked to the door. The weight of their next move hung in the air between them, the realization that they were no longer just fighting for survival. They were fighting for everything they believed in. The stakes were higher than ever, and the pressure was mounting with each passing moment. "We'll need backup," Varian said, his voice steady. "We can't take on Tyrannes alone." But we can't wait either. Lyra's gaze softened for a brief moment before her steely resolve returned. I'll start coordinating with our allies. We move tonight. The sense of urgency was undeniable. They had no time to waste. Every second counted, and the danger was growing with every moment that passed. But as they turned to leave the archive room, Varian felt something shift between them. The unspoken bond they had been forging in the heat of their shared struggle was becoming something stronger, something deeper. And yet, it couldn't be the focus now. Tyrannies had to be stopped. They both knew that the coming battle would decide not just their fates, but the future of their entire world. As they moved into the darkened hallways, the tension between them was palpable, but it was a tension that had forged a new understanding. They were no longer just allies. They were partners in every sense of the word, and together they would stop Tyrannies whatever it took. The night had fallen heavy over the fortress, the world outside a swirling mass of shadows and cold, unforgiving winds. Varian stood at the edge of the courtyard, his mind whirring with the weight of the decisions that had led them here. He could feel the tension still hanging in the air between him and Lyra, a palpable thing that neither of them could ignore, but neither of them fully addressed. It was there, in the stolen glances, in the way their bodies naturally gravitated toward one another, a silent acknowledgement of a bond being forged in the crucible of danger. But there was no time for it now. The war was at their doorstep. Lyra moved beside him, her tall form cutting a striking silhouette against the dim moonlight. Her golden eyes gleamed faintly, more animal than human in the low light. Her fur shimmered like woven silver strands, an iridescent quality that spoke of her otherworldly heritage. He could feel her presence, powerful and steady, her sharp senses on constant alert, but still, the weight of the coming battle hung between them like an unspoken promise. "Do you trust them?" Lyra's voice broke the silence, and Varian turned to face her. Her question wasn't just a casual inquiry. There was a layer of depth to it, a question about loyalty, about the allies they had gathered to stop Tyrannies and Seraphim. They had sent out word to trusted individuals, those who had proven themselves before, those who might still stand with them in the face of this treachery. But in a situation like this, with everything on the line, how much could they truly trust anyone? "I have to," Varian answered, his voice steady but with a hint of uncertainty that he couldn't completely suppress. "We don't have the luxury of second-guessing. We have to move fast, or we risk giving Tyrannies more time to organize." Lyra didn't say anything at first, her gaze fixed on the horizon. For a moment, she seemed distant, lost in thought. But then her eyes met his again, and there was a quiet intensity there. "I don't like how quiet it is," she said, her tone low and filled with something akin to a hunter's instinct. "It feels like we're being watched." Varian stiffened. It wasn't paranoia. The silence was too perfect, too unnerving. It was as though the fortress itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. "We'll have to be extra careful," he replied, his hand instinctively going to the hilt of his sword. The feel of the familiar metal was comforting, but in a situation like this, it wasn't enough. They needed to move, needed to secure their position before Tyrannies, or worse, the traitors they'd yet to uncover, could make their move. "I'm ready," Lyra said simply, her voice a quiet promise. She wasn't just ready to fight. She was ready to face whatever danger lay ahead, ready to deal with whatever consequences came their way. Her loyalty wasn't just to the mission, it was to him in ways that were slowly becoming undeniable. Varian met her gaze, and for a fleeting moment, the world outside the fortress walls seemed to fade away. It was just the two of them, standing there in the dark, a subtle understanding passing between them. But there was no time to linger on it. The world was about to shatter, and they both knew it. "We move now," he said, his voice commanding, breaking the tension. Lyra nodded and followed him as they made their way through the silent halls. Each step felt heavier, the weight of their task pressing down with every breath they took. They reached the operations room, a dimly lit space filled with scattered maps, intelligence reports, and weapons. Their allies had already gathered. Quiet murmurs filled the air as they exchanged last-minute details, preparing for what was to come. Varian recognized some faces, trusted soldiers and advisors, those who had fought alongside him in the past, but others were new, faces that had come from the shadows, brought in by the fragile threads of trust. Lyra stepped forward, immediately taking her place at the head of the table. Her presence commanded attention, the quiet power of a warrior who had seen things many others couldn't even imagine. Varian stood by her side, surveying the group. His mind was sharp, calculating, looking for the smallest hint of deception. But for now, they were all allies. "We need to move fast," Varian began, his voice cutting through the murmurs. "Tyrannies' forces are mobilizing. If we don't strike now, we risk losing any advantage we have left." Lyra spoke next, her words measured and confident. "We'll take the main base first. We know where the weapon caches are stored. We've trained for this." Her eyes swept over the group, looking for signs of hesitation, but none came. Varian looked down at the map spread across the table, his finger tracing the lines that marked key points of interest. The plan was simple, but the stakes were high. The base was heavily fortified, and the element of surprise would be their only advantage. They couldn't afford to fail. "Any questions?" Varian asked, his eyes scanning the room. A few soldiers exchanged glances, but the tension was palpable. Finally, one of them, a grizzled veteran with silver in his hair, spoke up. "What about Seraphim?" he asked, his voice heavy with suspicion. "We've been hearing rumors that he's already set the plan in motion. He won't be easy to find." Varian's jaw tightened at the mention of Seraphim's name. The traitor had proven himself dangerous, a puppet master who had pulled the strings behind the scenes. But it was Tyrannies that worried him most. Seraphim was a shadow in comparison to the full force of Tyrannies' influence. "We'll deal with Seraphim if we have to," Varian said, his voice firm. "But we need to stop Tyrannies first. He's the one pulling the strings." Lyra stepped forward, her gaze never leaving the map. "We'll split into two groups. One will take the main entrance, the other will infiltrate through the tunnels. Varian, you'll lead the team through the tunnels." Varian's heart skipped a beat at her words, but he didn't let it show. He would be with her again side by side. But the urgency of the situation kept him focused. "Understood. We move as soon as the signal is given." The room fell into a heavy silence as the final plans were made. There was no more time for doubt, no more time for second-guessing. They were committed now, with Tyrannies' forces out there and the threat of betrayal looming large. They couldn't afford to wait. As the group gathered their weapons and prepared to move, Varian's thoughts turned to Lyra. She stood beside him, her movements purposeful, her eyes locked on the mission ahead. But when their gazes met, there was something more in her expression, something unspoken. He didn't know what would happen after this, whether they would survive this night or fall, but he knew one thing for certain. Whatever lay ahead, he wasn't facing it alone. The bond between them had grown over the past days, forged in the fire of shared danger and uncertainty. And now it was more than just about stopping Tyrannies. It was about protecting each other, about facing the unknown together. As the door to the operations room opened, the group filtered out, ready to take on the night. Varian could feel the weight of the coming battle settle in his bones. It was going to be a long night, but they would see it through, together. And as they moved toward their respective positions, one thing became clear to him. This fight was only the beginning. The darkness of the underground tunnels wrapped around Varian like a suffocating cloak, the damp stone walls pressing in on him with every step. He could hear the distant sounds of their comrades preparing for the assault above, the muffled orders and the clattering of armor blending with the echoes of their own movement. But here, beneath the fortress, it was just the two of them, him and Lyra. They moved with quiet precision, their steps as light as shadows, despite the weight of their task. Varian's thoughts were sharp, calculating, always 2 steps ahead, but every now and then, his attention wandered to the woman at his side, Lyra. He had come to rely on her in ways he hadn't anticipated, not just as a fierce warrior, but as someone who understood the silent language of survival. Her presence was reassuring, But there was something else in the air, something unspoken but undeniable. She glanced at him over her shoulder, her golden eyes glinting faintly in the darkness. "We're almost there," she whispered, her voice soft yet commanding. Varian nodded. There was a flicker of something in her gaze, something that seemed to hold more than the battle ahead. But now wasn't the time to address it. He focused on the task at hand. They had to breach the central control room before Tyrannis could trigger whatever plan he was orchestrating. The tunnels were narrow, winding, and dark, but they knew them well. These were the same paths they had used for countless covert missions in the past. The air around them was thick with the scent of earth and moisture, and the further they went, the more oppressive it became. Varian's hand instinctively gripped the hilt of his sword as they reached the end of the tunnel, the heavy wooden door ahead marking the entrance to the heart of Tyrannis' operation. The plan had been simple. Enter undetected, disable any defenses, and take control of the room before reinforcements could arrive. But simple plans rarely went off without a hitch. Lyra stopped just before the door, holding up a hand. Varian froze, his senses sharpening, the hairs on the back of his neck standing on end. Something was wrong. The low hum of machinery beyond the door was louder than it should have been, a mechanical pulse that resonated deep within his chest. It wasn't just the sound of the fortress's generators. This was something else, something more sinister. "Do you hear that?" Lyra's voice was barely above a whisper, her head tilting slightly as she listened. Varian's heart skipped a beat. "Yes," he said. "It's not right." Before he could say anything else, the door before them slid open with a slow, ominous hiss. Varian's hand flew to his sword, but Lyra was already moving, her movements fluid and swift. Her tall frame slipped through the doorway like a shadow, her senses alert to every flicker of movement. Varian followed, his pulse racing. The room was vast, far larger than he had expected. The ceiling stretched high above them, supported by thick beams of metal and stone. The walls were lined with rows of intricate machinery, humming and buzzing with life. At the center of the room was a massive control panel, glowing with lights that blinked and shifted in irregular patterns. But there were no guards, no sign of the soldiers they had anticipated, only the low, unsettling hum of the machines. Varian's breath caught in his throat. It was too quiet. Lyra's sharp eyes scanned the room, searching for any sign of movement. "This doesn't feel right," she muttered, her voice tense. Varian nodded. He could feel it too. They were walking into a trap. The feeling of being watched, of being drawn into something much bigger than themselves, clawed at his thoughts. The walls seemed to close in on them, the machinery buzzing louder, as if it were feeding off their growing unease. He motioned for Lyra to move closer, his voice a low murmur. "We need to disable the main controls before anything else happens." She didn't need to be told twice. With a fluid motion, she sprinted toward the console, her long strides carrying her effortlessly across the room. Varian kept pace, but his mind was elsewhere. The air around them felt thick, as though the room itself were waiting for something. He had a nagging suspicion that they weren't alone. Suddenly, the hum grew louder, and the lights above flickered ominously. The ground beneath their feet trembled as a low, mechanical growl rumbled from somewhere deep within the room. Lyra froze mid-step, her body tensing as her golden eyes darted around, seeking the source. Varian's own senses were on high alert, every nerve straining. Before he could react, a voice echoed out from the shadows, smooth and dangerous. "Did you really think it would be that easy?" Varian's heart sank as he turned toward the voice. There, standing in the center of the room, was Seraphim. His figure loomed tall and imposing, his dark cloak billowing around him like a living thing. His smile was cold, a mockery of everything Varian had trusted. "How could you be so naive?" Seraphim's voice was laced with disdain, and his eyes gleamed with malicious amusement. "Did you honestly think you could just walk in here and expect to leave alive?" Lyra's hand flew to her weapon, but Varian stopped her with a firm grip on her arm. He had faced Seraphim before. He knew better than to let anger cloud his judgment. The traitor had a way of twisting words, of bending situations to his favor. But this time, Varian wasn't going to fall for it. "We know what you're planning, Seraphim," Varian said, his voice steady, though his heart was pounding in his chest. "And it's over. We're shutting you down." Seraphim's smile only widened. "Shutting me down? You don't understand, Varian. This isn't about control. It's about power. And you're standing in the way of something much bigger than you can comprehend." The ground rumbled again, louder this time, as if in response to his words. Varian's blood ran cold. They had underestimated the scale of this operation, but they hadn't come this far just to turn back now. "We'll see about that," Lyra said, her voice dripping with venom. She took a step forward, ready to fight, but Seraphim raised a hand. "Not so fast," he said with a mocking tone. "You're too late. The process has already begun." Varian's pulse quickened. "What process?" Seraphim's eyes gleamed with malice. "You'll find out soon enough." Suddenly, the room erupted in a blinding flash of light, and the machines began to spin faster, louder, as the true nature of their trap revealed itself. The ground beneath them shifted, and Varian realized with a sinking feeling that they were standing on the edge of a much larger scheme than they had ever imagined. "Get ready," Varian murmured to Lyra, his hand tightening around the hilt of his sword. Whatever Seraphim had set in motion, it was only just beginning, and they would have to face it together no matter the cost. The sudden flash of light had thrown the entire room into chaos. Varian's eyes were stinging, his hand instinctively going to his sword, his body poised for any threat. The noise was deafening now, the machines surrounding them humming and whirring with unnatural speed. He could feel the vibrations beneath his feet, a tremor running through the ground as if the whole fortress was coming alive. Lyra was already moving, her lithe form darting to the side, her hand gripping the handle of her blade. "We need to stop it," she shouted over the noise, her voice cutting through the frenzy like a sharp knife. Varian nodded, though his gut twisted in uncertainty. The control panel in front of them had gone wild, lights blinking erratically as the machines hummed with an almost frantic energy. He couldn't understand it fully yet, but he knew they were running out of time. "Cover me," Varian ordered as he stepped forward, his eyes scanning the control board. He could see wires sparking and the flashing lights signaling some sort of countdown. A sinking feeling in his stomach told him that whatever Seraphim had started, it wasn't just a simple malfunction. This was something more dangerous. Lyra didn't hesitate. Her sword was already in her hand, her golden eyes scanning the room as she positioned herself between Varian and the entrance. "I'll keep you covered," she said, her voice steady, though the tension in her posture was palpable. Varian's fingers flew over the control panel, tracing the patterns of the wiring. His mind raced. There was no time for hesitation. The machines were already far beyond the point of no return. The process Seraphim had spoken of was unfolding, and if they didn't stop it, the consequences would be devastating. But as he worked, a new sense of urgency clawed at him. Every moment spent in this room felt like an eternity, the weight of Lyra's presence pressing against his thoughts. He could feel the heat of her near him, her movements graceful but powerful, a constant reminder of how much he depended on her. He couldn't afford distractions now, not when the fate of their mission was on the line. But there was no denying it. The closer they stood, the more the atmosphere seemed to shift. Varian had never thought of himself as a man susceptible to such emotions. Yet every brush of her hand, every glance from those deep golden eyes, seemed to stir something inside him. It was confusing, the desire to focus on the mission, while another part of him craved the quiet moments they had shared together. The physical connection that had been growing between them, always just beyond the surface, was becoming harder to ignore. He shook the thought away. Focus, he told himself. The sudden sound of footsteps approaching snapped Varian back to the present. Lyra's sword whipped through the air as she spun to face the direction of the new threat. Varian's heart raced as he watched Seraphim emerge from the shadows, his tall form cutting through the chaos like a shadow. "Did you honestly think you could stop this?" Seraphim's voice was calm, almost too calm, as if he was savoring their struggle. His eyes gleamed with an unsettling amusement as he stepped forward. his cloak billowing around him. Varian's grip on his sword tightened. You won't win, Seraphim, he said, his voice low but firm. Seraphim's lips curled into a smile. I already have, he said simply, his hand moving to a control panel of his own. You've walked right into my trap, Varian. You have no idea what you're dealing with. The machines hummed louder, the energy in the room building to an almost unbearable level. Varian's instincts screamed at him to stop him before it was too late. He lunged forward, but Seraphim's hand shot out, pressing a button on his control panel. The room seemed to tremble beneath their feet as a massive surge of energy shot through the walls. Lyra's shout rang out as she leaped toward Seraphim, but the air itself seemed to grow thicker, more suffocating. Varian could barely keep his balance as the room shook again, a low rumbling, noise filling the space. The walls seemed to pulse with power, the lights flickering in time with the strange energy building in the center of the room. You fool, Varian hissed. You're going to destroy everything. Seraphim laughed, a hollow, almost manic sound. I've already done it. The foundation of everything is crumbling, Varian. The machines are no longer just tools. They're alive now, controlled by something much greater than you could ever imagine. Lyra's eyes widened, but before she could speak, the air around them shifted again. It was as though the room itself had taken on a new, more dangerous presence. Something was awakening. Varian felt a shift in the atmosphere. He could almost taste it. A deep, primal energy that seemed to pulse from the very heart of the room. What have you done? Lyra growled, her voice tight with rage. Seraphim stepped back, his hands still on the console, and the room seemed to fall into an unnatural stillness. For a moment, there was only silence, but it was not peaceful. It was the calm before the storm. A strange sound began to reverberate through the walls, like the creaking of metal, or perhaps the groaning of something ancient and powerful waking from a long slumber. Varian felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. Something was coming, something far more dangerous than Seraphim. Lyra's eyes darted around the room, her hand gripping her sword tighter. This isn't over, she said, her voice low, but her resolve unshaken. Varian nodded, his jaw clenched. We can't stop now. We have to find a way to disable the machines before it's too late. They turned back to the control panel, but as Varian reached forward to try and disconnect the power, a wave of energy shot through the room, knocking them both back. They collided with the cold stone floor, the impact stealing the breath from Varian's lungs. His vision blurred for a moment as the world around him spun. Lyra's hand shot out to steady him. Varian, she murmured, her voice filled with concern. Her grip on his arm was firm, but there was something more in the way she held him. A sense of urgency, a quiet determination that spoke volumes. We're not finished yet, Varian muttered. His voice strained as he pushed himself to his feet. The room was growing hotter, the air thick with the buzz of power. The energy from the machines was reaching a critical point. Lyra stood beside him, her posture unwavering. Then we need to hurry, she said, her golden eyes locked on his, the intensity of her gaze fueling his resolve. Varian's heart raced, not from fear, but from something else, something deeper. But there was no time to think about it now. They had to stop Seraphim. They had to stop the chaos he had unleashed. And they had to do it before everything they had fought for was lost. The battle was far from over. Varian's body was heavy with exhaustion, each movement dragging more than the last as they pushed through the corridors. The tension had been building in the air for what felt like hours. Every corner they turned, every door they forced open, led to more chaos. The machines had come alive completely and utterly. It was as if the very foundation of the facility was screaming, groaning beneath the weight of Seraphim's design. They had to reach the core, but the path was far from straightforward. The walls hummed with dark energy, shifting and changing as if alive, responding to the threat they posed. The further they advanced, the more Varian could feel the pressure building around him, a palpable force closing in. It was hard to think straight, his instincts telling him that time was running out. Lyra, as always, was steady. Her presence was a quiet anchor, even as they pushed forward through the trembling facility. Her golden eyes flickered as she glanced around, her sharp senses alert to every sound, every movement. She was focused, but Varian couldn't help but feel a strange tug inside him every time their hands brushed, or when she would momentarily glance at him. Her presence was constant now, a part of him, and the weight of her gaze was never far behind. Her breath was steady as she led them through the darkened halls. "The core is close," she said, her voice low but confident. "We're almost there." Varian nodded, though his thoughts were scattered. How many times had he thought about how this mission would end? Never in his wildest dreams had he imagined standing here, side by side with someone like her. Someone so unlike him, yet so much the same. His gaze lingered on her for a moment longer than necessary, her long, lithe form cutting through the dark. The connection between them had only grown stronger in the last hours, a thread they both seemed to be pulled along by. Varian couldn't ignore the warmth in his chest when he looked at her, the bond that had formed between them. But there was no time for distraction. The echo of distant footsteps snapped him out of his thoughts. A chill ran down his spine. Seraphim was closer now. The sound of the enemy's approach was unmistakable. Heavy boots against stone, the cold clink of armor. They had no more time to waste. "Ready?" Varian asked, turning to Lyra. His voice was steady, but even he could feel the tension creeping into his muscles. The closer they got to the core, the more unstable the facility seemed to become. Lyra's eyes met his, and for a brief moment, he saw something deeper there. An understanding, a shared resolve. "Let's finish this," she said, her voice soft but filled with a quiet determination. They turned the final corner, and the massive doors to the central chamber loomed before them. Varian's heart pounded in his chest as he drew his sword, gripping the hilt tight. Lyra's own blade was at the ready, her stance poised and powerful. The doors shuddered, vibrating with the same eerie energy that had filled the entire place since they'd stepped foot inside. Varian reached forward, pushing the door open with a heavy breath. The room beyond was vast, darker than the rest of the facility, the air thick with the hum of strange, otherworldly power. And then they saw him. Seraphim stood at the center of the room, his back turned, his hands raised toward the massive machinery in front of him. His dark cloak swirled in the air, an aura of dominance radiating from him. "So, you've made it this far," Seraphim said, his voice like velvet, smooth and dangerous. "But it's too late now." Varian's gaze locked onto Seraphim, the man responsible for everything that had gone wrong. "We'll stop you, no matter what it takes." Seraphim didn't turn around, his focus still entirely on the power source in front of him. "You're so certain, Varian," he said, his voice dripping with amusement. "But you fail to see. This is beyond both of you." Lyra's eyes narrowed. She stepped forward, her sword glinting in the dim light. "We're not done yet," she said firmly. "You've unleashed something you can't control." Finally, Seraphim turned around, his eyes gleaming with cold confidence. "I already control everything," he said, his lips curling into a smile. "The power has already merged with the machines. It's no longer about control, it's about domination. And when the core activates, all of this will be mine." Varian's stomach twisted with dread as he stepped forward. "Then we'll stop it now," he said, his voice resolute. A strange, pulsing energy filled the room, growing louder and more powerful as Seraphim began to chant under his breath. The ground shook as the machines around them responded, whirring and spinning faster. The core was active now, and it was feeding off Seraphim's power, the entire structure coming alive like a beast. Lyra's eyes widened as she felt the surge of energy, her feet planting firmly on the ground. "We need to destroy the core now." Varian moved forward, but Seraphim's laughter echoed through the chamber, cutting through the tension. "You think you can stop me? You're too late." His hands glowed with an eerie light as he raised them, and the room exploded with a pulse of energy. The force of it slammed into Varian, sending him sprawling back into the stone wall. Pain shot through his body as his head cracked against the surface, blurring his vision. He gasped for breath, the force of the energy leaving him winded. Varian! Lyra's voice was sharp, but he barely registered it. She was already at his side, her hand gripping his arm, her touch grounding him in the chaos. He met her gaze, his heart thudding in his chest. We have to. But before he could finish, the lights in the room flickered violently, the energy in the air intensifying to an almost unbearable degree. The core was reaching its peak, the machines around them vibrating with power. Lyra's grip tightened. We don't have much time, she said, her voice strained. The core's destabilizing. It could explode at any moment. Varian nodded, pushing himself to his feet, though his limbs felt like lead. There was no time to waste. They were running out of options, but they couldn't let Seraphim win. With a final glance at Lyra, Varian's resolve hardened. They had one last chance. One last chance to stop Seraphim, and to stop the machines that could destroy everything they had fought for. But the question that lingered in his mind was this: would they be able to survive the storm they were about to face? The room trembled with the pulse of energy as the core hummed to life. Its dark, foreboding light flickering like a heartbeat. Seraphim stood at the center, his hands raised high as he guided the power, weaving it with his own twisted intentions. The very air seemed to crackle with tension as the energy built to a dangerous crescendo. It was no longer just a fight for control. It was a race against time, a battle for the very future of the world. Varian's vision swam with dizziness, his body still recovering from the force of the previous blast. He struggled to his feet, shaking off the pain. His mind was clear now, sharper than before. He could feel the heat of Lyra's presence beside him, her steady breath mingling with his own. She was his anchor in this storm, his connection to something worth fighting for. We have to destroy it, Varian said, his voice low but filled with determination. We can't let Seraphim finish this. Lyra nodded without hesitation, her eyes fixed on the core. The power swirling around them was suffocating, but she didn't flinch. Her hands tightened around her blade, her expression set with an intensity that mirrored his own. They had been through too much together, and there was no way they would let everything they fought for crumble. Stay close, Lyra murmured, her voice barely audible above the hum of the machines. She stepped forward, her sword raised, her muscles taut as she prepared for the final confrontation. Varian followed, heart pounding in his chest. Every step felt like it could be their last. Seraphim's laugh echoed through the room, dark and mocking, his voice reverberating off the walls. You think you can stop me now? He taunted. It's too late. The power is already mine. Varian clenched his jaw. We'll see about that, he muttered under his breath. The closer they got, the more unstable the environment became. The ground shook beneath their feet, the walls trembling as the energy threatened to tear the place apart. The temperature was rising, sweat trickling down Varian's brow as he focused on the core. They had to disable it, destroy it, before it consumed everything. Lyra's eyes flashed with recognition as she surveyed the machinery. There, she said, pointing to a series of exposed conduits connected to the center of the core. If we can overload those connections, we might be able to disrupt the energy flow. Varian nodded. I'll cover you. Without another word, Lyra sprinted toward the center of the room, her blade gleaming in the dim light. Varian followed close behind, scanning the room for any sign of Seraphim's next move. They had no time to waste. The energy was escalating rapidly. If they didn't act now, it would be too late. Seraphim's expression twisted into something darker, more menacing. He lowered his hands, and the very air seemed to thrum with his power. Fools, he spat, his voice laced with venom. You cannot stop what's already been set in motion. Your world is mine to claim. The ground beneath Varian's feet cracked, and the walls shook as Seraphim's power surged. The core responded, its pulsating glow brighter and more dangerous than ever before. Varian could feel the heat radiating from it, the force threatening to overwhelm them. They had to act fast. Lyra reached the conduits, her blade raised high as she prepared to strike. Varian stood at the ready, his sword held tight in his grip, watching for any signs of movement. He could feel the tension building, the weight of the moment settling on him. This was it. They were at the tipping point. Lyra now, Varian shouted. In a swift, fluid motion, Lyra struck the first conduit with her blade. The shock wave of the blow sent a ripple through the room, and the core trembled. Seraphim's eyes widened in fury. No! He shouted, his voice cracking with rage. But it was too late. The conduit sparked and crackled, the energy destabilizing as Lyra's blade cut through the connections. The core began to hum louder, its light flickering wildly as the power within it began to spiral out of control. Varian felt the air grow thick with static, the energy surging like a wild storm. The walls groaned as if they, too, were about to give way under the strain. Varian didn't hesitate. He rushed forward, closing the distance between himself and Seraphim. The enemy leader raised his hands, trying to summon the remaining energy, but his movements were sluggish, panicked. The power he had once controlled was slipping away from him. "You won't stop me?" Seraphim snarled, his eyes burning with fury. "You can't." Before he could finish, Varian lunged, his sword slicing through the air with precision. He wasn't going to give Seraphim a chance to recover. The blade connected, striking Seraphim's arm with a sharp, resounding clash. The enemy staggered back, grimacing as he tried to maintain his grip on the power he had stolen. But it was already too late. The core behind them shuddered, the energy within it now completely out of control. The room seemed to implode with force, the power imploding upon itself in a flash of blinding light. Varian barely had time to react as he was thrown back by the explosion of energy. The shockwave sent him crashing into the ground, his body aching with the impact. For a moment, everything was chaos. Screams, the sound of machines breaking apart, the very foundation of the facility crumbling around them. Then, everything went silent. Varian lay there, breathless, his chest rising and falling rapidly as he tried to gather his bearings. Slowly, he pushed himself up, wincing with pain. His vision swam, but he could see that the room had been reduced to rubble. The core was no more. The machines had fallen silent. The threat was gone. His eyes searched the room, finding Lyra standing a few feet away. She, too, looked battered but unbroken. Their eyes met, and in that moment, a quiet understanding passed between them. They had done it, together. Lyra stepped forward, her presence a calming force in the midst of the wreckage. "It's over," she said, her voice soft but firm. Varian nodded, though his heart was heavy with the weight of everything they'd been through. The world was safe for now, but there was so much more to rebuild, so much more to do. Lyra's hand brushed against his, a silent gesture that spoke volumes. They had survived. They had fought for something greater than themselves. And now, as they stood together in the wreckage of Seraphim's ambitions, they knew that they had forged a bond that could not be broken. And as they walked away from the ruined facility, their journey was far from over. But no matter where it would take them, they would face it side by side.